Paris, 1936. A woman sits in an elegant apartment at 9 Rue de Beaujolais, surrounded by surrealist paintings that would one day hang in museums. Velvet curtains frame tall windows overlooking the Palais Royal. Her neighbor is Collet, the celebrated French novelist. On the walls hang original works by René Magritte, the Belgian surrealist who painted her portrait just months earlier. Her name is Suzanne Spaak, and she's living a life most people can only dream of. Born Suzanne Augustine Lorge on July 6, 1905 in Brussels, she came from one of Belgium's most prosperous banking families. Her father, Louis Lorge, was a successful stockbroker who provided his daughter with every advantage. At 20, she married Claude Spaak, a Brussels-born dramatist and filmmaker whose work would grace stages across Europe. But this wasn't just any marriage into the arts. Claude's brother was Paul-Henri Spaak, who would become Belgium's foreign minister and later one of the founding fathers of the European Union. With 2 children, Lucie and Paul-Louis, affectionately called Pilette and Bazou, Suzanne seemed to have it all: wealth, status, culture, and connection to power. When the family moved to Paris in 1936, they entered the heart of European high society. The Spaaks weren't just art collectors. They were patrons who supported René Magritte during the Great Depression, arranging a monthly stipend when no one was buying his work. Magritte responded with gratitude, painting portraits of Suzanne and her children that captured their world of privilege and beauty. But something was happening beneath the surface of Suzanne's gilded life. The political climate across Europe was darkening. Fascism was rising in Germany, Italy, and Spain. In the salons and cafes of Paris, intellectuals debated what it all meant. Suzanne was listening. She was thinking. And she was beginning to feel a growing sense of unease about the world around her. By the late 1930s, Suzanne had joined the Comité Mondial des Femmes contre la Guerre et le Fascisme, the World Committee of Women Against War and Fascism. It was a bold step for someone of her social standing. While other wealthy Parisians focused on their next gallery opening or dinner party, Suzanne was aligning herself with activists who opposed the tide of authoritarianism sweeping across the continent. This wasn't just fashionable political dabbling. It was the beginning of a transformation that would define the rest of her life. Then came May 19, 1940. The German Wehrmacht invaded France with overwhelming force. The French army, once considered the finest in Europe, collapsed in 6 weeks. By June 14th, German troops marched down the Champs-Élysées. Paris, the city of light, fell under the shadow of the swastika. The Spaak family initially fled south to Saint-Maxime in the unoccupied zone, but Paris was their home. Eventually, they returned to a city utterly transformed. The Paris that Suzanne returned to was unrecognizable. German officers filled the cafes where she once met with artists and intellectuals. Street signs appeared in German. Jewish businesses were marked with yellow stars. The Nazis implemented their racial laws with brutal efficiency, and the French Vichy government collaborated eagerly. Jews were required to register with authorities. Their property was confiscated. They were banned from public spaces, from certain professions, from normal life. And then came the roundups. Suzanne watched as her neighbors disappeared. Jewish families who had lived in Paris for generations were arrested in the middle of the night. Children were torn from their parents' arms. The authorities promised they were simply being relocated to work camps in the east. But Suzanne, like many others who paid attention, suspected the truth was far more sinister. She couldn't just stand by and watch. Something had to be done. That phrase, "something must be done," became her guiding principle. Il faut faire quelque chose. In 1941, Suzanne joined the National Movement Against Racism, known by its French acronym MNCR, the Mouvement National contre le Racisme. The male members of the French resistance initially greeted her offer with skepticism. Here was this wealthy socialite, accustomed to servants and silk dresses, wanting to join the dangerous underground. How long would she last when things got difficult? Would she crack under pressure? They gave her menial tasks at first, typing, distributing pamphlets, shopping for supplies, simple errands that kept her at arm's length from the real work. But Suzanne had no intention of remaining on the periphery. She began using her connections in ways that truly mattered. She walked the streets of Paris, knocking on the doors of physicians, lawyers, judges, educators, and clergy. She asked them to treat Jews who were in hiding and needed medical care. She asked them to provide false papers. She asked them to hide children. And because of who she was, because of her family name and social position, many of them said yes. Her apartment at Rue de Beaujolais became a meeting place for resistance members. The same rooms where she had once hosted sophisticated dinner parties now hosted clandestine meetings to save lives. Then Suzanne took an even more dangerous step. She joined the Red Orchestra, the Rote Kapelle in German, a Soviet intelligence network operating across occupied Europe. The Red Orchestra was founded by Leopold Trepper, a Polish Jewish communist who had created one of the most effective espionage networks of the war. From bases in Belgium, France, the Netherlands, and Switzerland, the network gathered critical intelligence on German military operations and passed it to Moscow. They had even managed to infiltrate the Abwehr, German military intelligence itself. The Nazis were terrified of the Red Orchestra. They created a special unit, the Sonderkommando Rote Kapelle, specifically to hunt down and destroy the network. This wasn't just another resistance group. This was an organization that posed a genuine threat to German war efforts. And Suzanne Spaak, the Belgian socialite, who had once worried about which dress to wear to the opera, was now part of this dangerous game of shadows and secrets. But Suzanne's most important work had nothing to do with espionage. Her true mission was saving children. In the wake of the mass deportations that began in 1942, thousands of Jewish children in Paris were left orphaned or at immediate risk. Many had been separated from their parents during roundups. Others had parents who had already been deported to camps in the east, to places with names like Auschwitz and Sobibor. These children were being held in facilities run by the UGIF, the Union Générale des Israélites de France, a Nazi-created organization supposedly for Jewish welfare. The truth was that these UGIF children's homes were little more than holding pens. The Gestapo knew exactly where these children were. They had complete lists with names, ages, and addresses. When the Nazis decided it was time for another deportation, they would simply show up at these facilities and load the children onto trucks bound for Drancy, the transit camp outside Paris. From Drancy, the trains left for Auschwitz. Very few ever returned. The children in these homes were living on borrowed time, and everyone knew it. In early 1943, Suzanne became part of a daring rescue operation. Working with Pastor Paul Vagar and Marcel Guillemot, along with other members of the resistance, she helped smuggle 163 Jewish children out of UGIF facilities in the Paris region. This wasn't a simple matter of walking them out the front door. The children needed false identity papers. They needed civilian clothes to replace their institutional garments. They needed ration cards so they could eat. Most critically, they needed safe places to hide. Suzanne used every resource at her disposal. She temporarily sheltered some of the children in her own apartment, an act of extraordinary courage that put her entire family at risk. If the Gestapo had discovered even one Jewish child hidden in her home, she would have been arrested immediately and likely executed. Her own children, Paulette and Bazou, would have been in danger. But Suzanne did it anyway. She provided the children with food, clothing, and comfort, while her network arranged for longer-term placements with families in the French countryside or in institutions willing to risk hiding them. The rescue network operated with remarkable efficiency. Members like Eugene Menkowski of the Children's Aid Society, the OSE, worked tirelessly to place children with foster families. Protestant churches opened their doors despite the danger. Individual French families, ordinary people with their own fears and families to protect, agreed to take in Jewish children and raise them as their own. Some would keep these children until the end of the war. Some would lose their own lives in the process. But because of people like Suzanne Spaak, hundreds of children who would have certainly died, instead, survived. Suzanne knew the risks she was taking. Every time she moved a child, every time she created a false document, every time she met with another member of the network, she was one mistake away from capture, and the Gestapo was closing in. The Red Orchestra was being systematically dismantled. In Belgium, in the spring of 1942, German counterintelligence had traced radio transmitters used by the network. They made their first arrests. Under torture, some captured members revealed names and locations. Over the next 18 months, more than 600 people connected to the Red Orchestra were arrested across occupied Europe. The special Gestapo unit hunting the Red Orchestra, led by officers like Karl Geering and later Heinz Panwitz, was relentless. They employed sophisticated radio direction finding equipment. They turned captured operatives into double agents. They conducted mass arrests based on intercepted communications. The net was tightening around everyone connected to the network, including Suzanne Spaak. It was only a matter of time. On November 9, 1943, the Gestapo arrested Suzanne in Brussels. They had found her name in documents seized during earlier raids. They knew she was part of the Red Orchestra. They knew she had helped Jewish children escape. They transferred her to Paris, to Fresnes Prison, the notorious facility in the southern suburbs where the Gestapo held captured resistance fighters. Fresnes was a place of horror. It was where prisoners were interrogated, tortured, and held in horrific conditions while awaiting their fate. Suzanne spent 9 months in Fresnes, 9 months of uncertainty, fear, and suffering. The Gestapo subjected her to brutal interrogation sessions, trying to extract names of other resistance members. They wanted to know about her connections to the Red Orchestra. They wanted details about the Children's Rescue Network. But Suzanne, this woman from the Belgian aristocracy who had lived a life of comfort and privilege, proved to be extraordinarily strong. She gave them nothing. She protected her comrades even under torture. In January 1944, a German military court sentenced her to death. Usually, such sentences meant transfer to Germany for execution. But by this time, the war was turning against the Nazis. The Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944 had opened a second front. American, British, and Canadian forces were fighting their way across France toward Paris. The liberation was coming. The Gestapo knew their time was running out. As Allied forces approached Paris in August 1944, the Gestapo began executing prisoners at Fresnes to prevent them from being liberated. They were destroying evidence and eliminating witnesses. On August 12, 1944, just 13 days before Allied forces would liberate Paris, Heinz Panwitz, the head of the Sonderkommando Rote Kapelle, personally shot Suzanne Spaak in her prison cell. She was 39 years old. She died knowing that liberation was imminent. She died knowing that the children she had saved would survive. Suzanne's body was buried anonymously in Bagneux Cemetery under a simple marker that read, "Une Belge," a Belgian woman. Her family didn't even know exactly where she was buried at first. In the chaos of liberation and the immediate aftermath of the war, her story was lost in the larger narrative of French resistance and Allied victory. Hundreds of thousands of people had died in the occupation. Millions had died across Europe. One woman's sacrifice seemed to disappear into the enormous tragedy of World War II. But the children remembered. All 163 children that Suzanne rescued in her final operation survived the war. Think about that for a moment. 163 human beings who would have died in Auschwitz lived because of her courage. They grew up, had families of their own, and told their children about the networks of people who had saved them. The ripple effects of Suzanne's actions extended far beyond those 9 months she spent in prison. They extended through generations. It took decades for Suzanne Spaak's story to truly emerge from obscurity. On April 21, 1985, more than 40 years after her death, Yad Vashem, Israel's official memorial to the victims of the Holocaust, recognized Suzanne Spaak as righteous among the nations. This is the highest honor Israel can bestow on non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. Her name was added to a wall of honor in Jerusalem, alongside thousands of others who chose humanity over self-preservation. But even with that recognition, Suzanne remained largely unknown outside of Holocaust education circles. In 2017, author Anne Nelson published Suzanne's Children, A Daring Rescue in Nazi Paris, a comprehensive biography that finally brought Suzanne's story to a wider audience. Nelson's meticulous research revealed the full scope of Suzanne's work and sacrifice. The book became a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award and was published in 8 countries. Finally, Suzanne Spaak was getting the recognition she deserved. What makes Suzanne's story so remarkable isn't just what she did, but who she was before she did it. She didn't have to become a resistance fighter. She could have stayed in her beautiful apartment, kept her head down, and survived the occupation in relative comfort. Her family connections might have even protected her. Her brother-in-law was a prominent political figure. Her husband moved in artistic circles that included collaborators as well as resistors. She had options. She chose the hardest one. There's something particularly powerful about someone who had everything to lose, choosing to risk it all. Suzanne understood that her privilege was not a shield to hide behind, but a tool she could use to help others. She leveraged her social connections, her wealth, her status, and ultimately her life itself, in service of children she had never met, children who came from families very different from her own, children whose only crime was being born Jewish in a time when that meant a death sentence. And she did this while maintaining her composure, her dignity, and her secrecy. She continued to appear at social functions when necessary, maintaining the facade of a normal life while running rescue operations behind the scenes. She protected her own children from the full knowledge of what she was doing, understanding that the less they knew, the safer they would be if she was caught. She compartmentalized her life with remarkable skill, showing different faces to different people while keeping her true mission hidden. The man of the French resistance, who had initially doubted her, proved to be completely wrong. Suzanne Spaak was not a dilettante playing at resistance. She was not a wealthy woman seeking excitement or meaning in dangerous times. She was a true believer in human dignity and justice, who was willing to sacrifice everything for those beliefs. Under pressure, under torture, under the threat of death, she never broke. She never gave up her comrades. She never revealed the locations of the children she had hidden. She held firm until the very end. Today, in Brussels, Suzanne Spaak's portrait by René Magritte hangs in the Magritte Museum. It's a haunting image, showing her face against a backdrop of clouds, an egg placed in front of her on red fabric. It was painted in 1936, when she was 31 years old, before the war, before the occupation, before she became a hero. Looking at that painting now, knowing what she would become and what she would sacrifice, adds layers of meaning that Magritte never intended. The woman in that portrait had no idea what was coming. She couldn't have known that within a decade she would be dead, executed in a prison cell for the crime of saving children. Suzanne Spaak's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about ourselves. What would we have done in her position? When faced with injustice and cruelty, would we have found the courage to act? Or would we have found reasons to justify inaction? It's easy to believe we would have been on the right side of history when looking back at events like the Holocaust. It's much harder to recognize when we're being called to act courageously in our own time. She also exemplifies something important about the nature of resistance itself. Resistance isn't always armed combat or dramatic sabotage. Sometimes resistance is simply refusing to accept that certain people are disposable. Sometimes it's using whatever resources you have, whether that's wealth, connections, or just space in your home, to protect the vulnerable. Sometimes courage looks like a well-dressed woman walking through Paris carrying forged documents in her handbag. Sometimes heroism wears an elegant dress and pals. The rescue networks that Suzanne participated in saved over 1,000 Jewish children in Paris alone. When you add up all the rescue efforts across France, thousands more survived. Each of those survivors went on to have families, careers, and lives that would have been cut short without intervention. The children Suzanne saved had children. Those children had children. The ripple effects of her courage echo through time in ways that are impossible to fully quantify. How many scientists, artists, teachers, parents, and friends exist today because Suzanne Spaak decided that something had to be done? It's worth noting that Suzanne's husband, Claude Spaak, survived the war. He lived until 1990, dying at the age of 85 in Fontenay-les-Bris, France. For many years after the war, he apparently did little to publicize his wife's heroism or clarify the circumstances of her death. Some historians have suggested he may have felt guilt over his own survival, or perhaps shame that he hadn't done more to protect her. Others speculate that the trauma of losing her in such circumstances made it too painful to discuss. Whatever his reasons, it meant that for decades, Suzanne's story remained obscure. Their children, Pilette and Bazou, grew up without their mother. They were teenagers when she was executed. They had to process not only her death, but also the revelation of the dangerous secret life she had been leading. Years later, the Spaak family donated paintings by Magritte, including portraits of Suzanne and her children, to museums. These works ensure that Suzanne's face, her presence, remains visible to new generations. They're a testament to a woman who chose conscience over comfort. Let's talk about the specific mechanics of what Suzanne and her network accomplished. Rescuing 163 children in a single operation from UGIF facilities was an enormous logistical challenge. First, they needed intelligence about when the Gestapo was planning raids. Then they needed to act quickly to remove the children before those raids occurred. The children had to be given new identities instantly. Birth certificates had to be forged. Ration cards had to be obtained, each one a criminal offense in itself. The children needed to be coached on their new names and backstories. They needed to be transported to safe locations without arousing suspicion. Then came the hardest part, finding families willing to take them in. Hiding a Jewish child during the occupation was extraordinarily dangerous. If discovered, the entire family could be arrested and deported. The punishment for helping Jews was severe, yet hundreds of French families agreed to do it anyway. Some were motivated by religious conviction, others by simple human decency. They opened their homes to children who were not their own, treated them as family, and kept their secrets even under pressure. These unnamed heroes formed the network that made Suzanne's rescue operations possible. The rescue operation also required money. Families hiding children needed financial support. Forged documents cost money. Transportation cost money. Safe houses had to be maintained. While some funds came through underground channels, including Jewish organizations and foreign aid, Suzanne used her own wealth as well. She spent her inheritance saving lives. Her art collection, her jewelry, her resources were all deployed in service of the mission. She literally put her money where her mouth was. After the war, when researchers began tracking the survival rates of Jewish children in different parts of France, they found stark differences based on whether effective rescue networks had operated in those regions. In areas where people like Suzanne had organized systematic rescue operations, survival rates were significantly higher. In areas without such networks, the survival rates were abysmal. The presence or absence of organized resistance directly determined who lived and who died. Individual acts of courage, multiplied across a network of committed people, made the difference between extinction and survival for France's Jewish children. The Red Orchestra, the Soviet intelligence network Suzanne worked with, had a complicated legacy. After the war, during the Cold War, being associated with a communist organization became problematic. Some members of the Red Orchestra who survived found themselves under suspicion in the West simply because they had worked with the Soviets. The heroism of fighting the Nazis became tangled up with Cold War paranoia about communism. For some historians, this complicated the story of the Red Orchestra and its members. But we should be clear, whatever the political affiliations of the people involved, the Red Orchestra did genuinely valuable work resisting Nazi Germany. They gathered intelligence that helped the Allied war effort. They saved lives. Suzanne Spaak's membership in this organization should be understood in the context of fighting fascism, not through the lens of later Cold War conflicts. Heinz Panwitz, the man who executed Suzanne, survived the war. He was captured by French forces in May 1945 near Bludenz, Austria. He was later turned over to Soviet authorities, who imprisoned him for his role in destroying the Red Orchestra. He spent years in Soviet prisons, including the notorious Lubyanka in Moscow. Eventually, he was released and returned to West Germany, where he lived until 1975. He never faced trial for Suzanne's execution or for his other crimes during the war. Like many Nazi officers, he benefited from Cold War politics that prioritized ex-Nazis who could be useful against the Soviets over justice for their victims. This is one of the bitter ironies of post-war justice. While some Nazi war criminals were prosecuted at Nuremberg and other trials, many others escaped accountability entirely. Men who had tortured and murdered resistance fighters, who had organized deportations, who had run concentration camps, often lived comfortable lives after the war. Some even worked for Western intelligence services. The Cold War created strange bedfellows and allowed many war criminals to reinvent themselves as anti-communist assets. Suzanne died in her prison cell, while men like Panwitz eventually died in their beds. That injustice is worth remembering. But let's return to Suzanne herself and what her life means. Her story is ultimately about the choices we make when confronted with evil. She could have made different choices at every turn. She could have looked away when Jews were being persecuted. She could have focused on protecting her own family. She could have convinced herself that one person couldn't make a difference. She could have given up names under torture to end her own suffering. At each of these decision points, she chose the harder path. She chose courage. She chose solidarity with the persecuted over safety for herself. What's particularly instructive about Suzanne's story is how gradually she was drawn into resistance work. She didn't wake up one morning and decide to become a spy and rescuer of children. It started with joining an anti-fascist women's organization. Then the war came, and she saw injustice unfolding around her. She started small, distributing pamphlets, doing basic support work. As she proved herself reliable, she was given more responsibility. As the situation grew more desperate, she took bigger risks. By the time she was hiding children in her apartment and working with Soviet intelligence, she had traveled a long path from her starting point as a wealthy socialite. This gradual progression is important because it shows that heroes aren't born, they're made through a series of choices. Each choice builds on the previous one. Each act of courage makes the next one more possible. Suzanne didn't have to be superhuman to do what she did. She just had to be willing to take the next step, and then the next one, and then the next one. That's actually more inspiring than if she had been some kind of fearless warrior from the start. It means ordinary people, people like us, can become extraordinary if we're willing to keep choosing courage. Her story also reminds us that privilege is not inherently good or bad. It's what we do with privilege that matters. Suzanne had enormous privilege, wealth, connections, education, social status. She could have used that privilege to insulate herself from the suffering around her. Instead, she weaponized it. She used her social connections to build her rescue network. She used her wealth to fund operations. She used her class status to move through Paris without arousing suspicion. Her privilege became a tool for resistance rather than a barrier to solidarity. That's a lesson worth remembering in any era. In our own time, we face different challenges than those of Nazi-occupied Paris. But the fundamental questions remain the same. When we see injustice, do we act or do we look away? When vulnerable people need help, do we take risks to provide it or do we rationalize why it's someone else's problem? When we have resources and advantages, do we use them only for ourselves or do we deploy them in service of something larger? Suzanne Spaak's life offers one answer to these eternal questions. It's an answer written in courage, compassion, and sacrifice. On August 25, 1944, 13 days after Suzanne was executed, General Philippe Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division liberated Paris. Crowds filled the streets celebrating. Church bells rang across the city. The nightmare was over. But for Suzanne, liberation came too late. She died in darkness, in a prison cell, probably not knowing how close freedom was. That tragic timing makes her story even more heartbreaking. She was so close to survival, so close to reuniting with her children, but she never made it. The Gestapo made sure of that. Yet in another sense, Suzanne did survive. She survived in the 163 children who lived because of her. She survived in the example she set for future generations about how to respond to injustice. She survived in the portrait painted by Magritte that now hangs in a museum, ensuring her face is not forgotten. She survived in the honor bestowed upon her by Yad Vashem and in the books written about her life. She survived in every person who learns her story and is inspired to be more courageous in their own life. The final image we should hold of Suzanne Spaak is not of her execution in that prison cell. The final image should be of her walking through Paris, carrying forged documents in her handbag, on her way to save another child. Confident, determined, refusing to accept that some lives are worth less than others, using every advantage she had been given by birth and circumstance to protect the most vulnerable members of society. That is the Suzanne Spaak worth remembering. That is the woman who should inspire us today. Her story asks us to examine our own lives and our own choices. It asks us to consider what we would do, what we will do, when faced with injustice. It reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear. It shows us that one person really can make a difference, and that the excuse of powerlessness is often just that, an excuse. Suzanne Spaak was not superhuman. She was a woman who decided that something must be done, and then did it, regardless of the cost. If she could do that, then perhaps we can too. Remember her name. Remember her courage. Remember the children she saved. Remember that when darkness falls, there are always people who choose to light a candle rather than curse the dark. Suzanne Spaak was one of those people. May her memory be a blessing, and may her example continue to inspire acts of courage and compassion in generations yet to come.